Thanks, Joe. It's a delight to be here. I haven't actually talked in this department since I think the late 1990s. I think it was even before Beck existed, right? So I'm going to talk about, it's a slightly different title, too many nouns, I realize, so let's move on from it. Why am I going to talk about inequality? Well, first of all, probably you're all very aware that the levels of inequality globally are increasing radically. Some people are getting richer and some people are getting poorer. This is probably to do with the advance of neoliberal economics across the world, but I'm not going to talk about that today. And this is happening in Africa as well as everywhere else. Many of you, who read The Economist and places like that will believe that Africa is getting richer and richer. It's the booming economy. It's where everybody should be investing. That is true. But it's also true that there's still millions and millions of people on the African continent who are living on basically less than $1 or $1.25 a day. This is accepting Nigeria and South Africa. So you still have extremely high levels of inequality. And what I'm going to talk about is inequality within a particular village. I'm actually very interested in global levels of inequality, but today my talk is going to be just on inequality in this particular village in Western Tanzania. And in this picture you see a thief, the guy who's being tried as a thief at least, for having stolen 3 little bags of tobacco from his wife. And he's being tried in a village court. We'll come back to the significance of this later. So inequality is, of course, characterizes, or varying levels of inequality characterize our lineage. And as you can see in this cartoon that I have here, and we can measure inequality, of course, not just in things like bags of tobacco, but other kinds of measures like reproductive skew. So, for example, our ancestors, hierarchical apes and also Australopithecines and Homo erectus, showed very high levels of inequality, at least if you measure it, as you can see here with extant gorilla populations. Very high levels of inequality as characterized by reproductive inequality. So here you have one male dominating or controlling a large number of females and being responsible for all of the offspring produced. And the same with Australopithecines and Homo erectus on the basis of body size differences between males and females, so probably very high levels of inequality, reproductive inequality. And then as we move down to about 200,000 years ago, we start to see the emergence of relatively egalitarian foragers. We see that on the basis both of sexual dimorphism in body size and also on the basis of evidence of contemporary savanna living foragers where you have high levels of, where you have little material inequality, you have little polygyny, and you have sort of antagonism against anybody who tries to be dominant within the group. And then about 12,000 years ago, we start to see the emergence of grave goods. We start to see the emergence in the archaeological record of differences in house sizes, house structure. And really from then on, the rest is history. They're just increasing levels of inequality throughout pastoral and agrarian populations up to the present. So that's a kind of back of the envelope sketch. The question of what generates inequality is probably one of the most over-theorized questions in the social sciences, and I'm not going to talk about it today. I just want to kind of put it up here that I know about these sort of things. Climate, the stability, increasing stability of the climate in the Holocene has been one of the arguments put forward. Food storage technology, elite control of clumped circumscribed resources, arguments based on the importance of consumption and display, Cohen's famous argument of population pressure, agricultural surpluses and division of labor, Joe and Rob's paper, and then the recent work we did on intergenerational transmission of resources. So there's lots of things we know about the causes of inequality, but what I'm going to talk about is the consequences, and I think this has been much less studied. And I'm going to look about specifically the consequences of inequality in a small African village. This is the same village. Here you see some women who are kind of pretty much fighting over food that we were distributing after an anthropometric session of measuring kids. And I'm going to look at the effects of inequality on both patterns of cooperation in this community and one measure of conflict. And I just put a star there. I've also worked on inequality in reproduction in this population. And just to kind of promote my own work, even though I'm not going to talk about it today, what we actually find here is that there's this higher variation in fitness amongst women as there is in men. And actually, contrary to Bateman's third principle, women benefit more from multiple spouses than do men. This was something that was picked up by the New York Times, who made this cartoon of a Pimbwe woman and her three subordinate sequential husbands. Anyhow, but I'm not going to talk about that kind of inequality today. And I gave this talk in Duke a couple of weeks ago, and I had much more kind of theory up front. And I'm actually now going to put more of the theoretical considerations to the end, because my basic point is that the effects of inequality on patterns of cooperation, pro-sociality in humans, I think are really poorly understood. I think under-theorized and poorly empirically studied at the moment. So I'm just going to give you a few kind of landmark ideas here to just sort of situate how you think about the primarily empirical study that I'm going to present today. So the standard economic model is basically that cooperation is favored when resources are unpredictable in order to minimize risk. And I'm going to sort of just take this, for example, from Bruce Winterhalter's paper on looking at food sharing in evolutionary anthropology, and the kind of work that Mike Gervin and many other people have been doing, who argue that the extensive levels of food sharing that we see in human populations are a way of basically buffering yourself against risk when resources are unpredictable. And of course, the reason I have a minus there, or a negative sign there, is that if you think about this, you would really expect that the people who are poorest, who face the most unpredictable resources, are going to be the ones who are most predisposed towards sharing. So you'd expect a negative association between wealth and pro-sociality, sharing, helping, whatever we're going to measure here. Even though, of course, it's very important to point out that that's based on all kinds of assumptions, and I'm not going to state at the moment, with respect to how the marginal returns vary across individuals of different resource holding power. Then sort of jumping to another kind of landmark idea is the work of political scientists, particularly this idea that cooperation, here they're particularly talking about cooperation over the provision of collective goods, is greatest in economically heterogeneous populations. And so I'm going back here all the way to people like Olson, who argued this point very strongly, that you need economic heterogeneity to generate public goods and collective action. And the idea here is that actually people at the top who are wealthiest or control most resources or have most power are going to be the people who are most likely to either be able to afford the costs of cooperation, or maybe afford the costs of punishing, or who may have greatest stake in the stability of the group and therefore be most willing to contribute. So that kind of predicts a positive association between wealth and or economic power and cooperation. And then just jumping to evolutionary biology, and of course evolutionary biologists, like political scientists, have done lots of theorizing about cooperation. But I suppose my point here is that all of these fields haven't really looked as closely as I would like at the effects of resource holding power on cooperation. But so within evolutionary biology, one very sort of prominent hypothesis here is the costly signaling idea, the idea that an individual signals their hidden quality through generosity, through giving, through some kind of publicly sort of obvious behavior. This is obviously Zahavi's idea, and Rebecca Bird and Eric Smith explored this by considering anthropological materials. And of course, a prediction here then would be positive, that it's the guys at the top or the women at the top who've got the most quality, even though it's kind of hidden, that somehow has to be demonstrated as a costly signal of their quality. And then the last sort of area of theory that I'm going to kind of be moving around is this whole idea about how wealth and wealth and relatedness might affect the degree of prosociality. And the idea here, of course, goes back to Hamilton's classic 67 paper, which is really derived on this idea of population viscosity, that if kin don't disperse very far, you grow up as an individual with your kin around you. And then whether you cooperate with them more or whether you compete with them is going to be entirely a function of the distribution of resources and all these ideas that I'm sure you're all very familiar with, local resource competition or local resource enhancement. And so, we have a kind of a framework for thinking about how kin and how relatedness and resource control might interact, but we don't really have very clear principled thinking about what kind of patterns we might expect. We have lots of empirical cases, of course. So with this kind of just outline of the kind of theoretical kind of landscape here, I'm going to move right on, as I said, onto the empirical work, because I want to sort of give you something to think about, and then we'll go back and think, but go back to the sort of theoretical issues later on. And so, my sort of big point here is really we need more empirical work looking at these kinds of questions, but particularly we need work looking at who cooperates and who defects and why. There's been lots of work about why people food share or why they don't food share at the sort of population level. Why do we have sharing in some populations, not in others? But the more nitty-gritty work of who does what, I think is really still poorly studied, although I've talked to 2 students today and heard interesting stuff but we are starting to move in this area. So my talk I'll first give you an introduction to Mpimbwe, and then I'm going to present a study of cooperation. This is basically a social network analysis of helping. I'm then going to present you some data I have on direct measures of conflict, which in this population is based on the distribution of witchcraft cases. And then I'm going to go back to both of these studies and just look at how wealth and kinship or relatedness interact to affect both cooperation and conflict. And the empirical stuff here is pretty straightforward. I'll then come back to in the conclusions at the end to sort of try to see where we are with this whole topic. So in Pimbwe, Western Tanzania, you can see here, this is a map of Tanzania, and this is where Katavi National Park is, and the Pimbwe live down the south of the park. I've been working there since 1995. Shockingly, I've hardly published anything because I do so many other things, but with lots of funders. This is a view across in the rainy season from the escarpment across. Actually, this is the village I work, Mirumba, and then there's Katavi National Park and lots of protected areas in the distance. The Pimbwe are Bantu agriculturalists. They also depend a lot on fishing. There's a lot of seasonal rivers in this plain. Honey collectors and traditionally hunters, although there's less hunting going on now because of increased protection of the national park. There's about 60,000 Pimbwe across 14 villages across the whole of the Rukwa Valley. And they're serially monogamous. I showed you a little cartoon of that earlier, with very high divorce rates. And nuclear family, they live almost always in nuclear families, or just a mum by herself or a dad by himself, maybe with a grandparent, in both sort of neolocal and ambilocal postmarital residence. Most people here are anthropologists, Dan isn't, but you'll just have to put up with no definition. The poverty and inequality is just in your face in this area. It's a very, very poor, remote part of Tanzania. It's been just off the radar. It's close to DRC, close to a lot of the refugee camps, people coming down from Burundi and Rwanda. Nobody kind of got interested in that area. So it's even back in the German period, it was considered a sort of remote and forgotten area of Africa, and it still feels like it. So poverty and inequality, when I put this slide up, it's actually not from the village I work in, but there is wealth, increasing wealth coming into the area, you'll see. And so this is a wealthy family. They don't speak English, but they did write Beware of Dog. They have a satellite dish, but then you can see how most Pimbwe live in just really pretty miserable mud huts. Huge variation in wealth. We see this from our evidence. I'm not going to present any of this, but just very, very high levels of food insecurity across really the whole of the area. We have extremely high levels of stunting, kids low height for age, in 45%, which is the highest of anywhere in Tanzania and almost as high as anywhere in Africa apart from parts of DRC. Very high levels of child mortality. Craig and Crystal have done work on a lot of maternal depression as well. And, well, I mean, I don't like saying this because I've worked in lots of different places in Africa, and I really love doing field work. It's kind of what drives me, and I have to say working in this area is pretty depressing. Just so much goes wrong, and life is just so difficult. Particularly if you're Pimbwe, but even if you're an ethnographer. Part of the problem here is that the Pimbwe was thrown out of the area that's now Katavi National Park, you see in the picture at the bottom, through various evictions from the 1950s onwards. And so people who were traditionally fishers and hunters, who were really poor agriculturalists, are now having to depend almost entirely on maize and millet cultivation, and they're just not very good at it. So I'm a little side thing here. We've just finished a book on the history of the Pimbwe, which is being distributed to all the kids in the schools across the 14 villages, because we really want to try to encourage the Pimbwe to think more positively about their history, to realize that Katavi is their homeland. I mean, they kind of remember it, but try to empower them that this can be used in sort of conservation strategies that conservation and development strategies that I'm actually very actively involved in at the moment. So just a little bit more on, there's a road coming down into the area. It just happens in our miserable little village, the present Prime Minister of the country hails from. And so, with prime ministerial politics, a road is finally coming down into the Rukwa Valley. You can see this road going right through Marumba, the village where I work. It's totally destroyed, all kinds of it's awful stuff going on. Of course, roads do bring wealth, right? And they bring a market for crops. And this is obviously what's going to be driving a lot of the wealth differentiation I could be talking about. Roads also bring all kinds of problems like land grabs, people coming from outside trying to get this land in the Rukwa Valley, outsiders, Chinese, American universities, people from other tribes up in the highlands. Which of course leads to greater poverty amongst the people who can't protect their land. Disease, obviously a high HIV area this, and we know that HIV follows roads, so this is another problem. But we're getting the emergence of all this private wealth that people can now get mobile cell phones. You saw the satellite dish, a couple of people have motorbikes. There's all the kinds of signs of economic advancement that we see all over the world. And this is, so that's just, when they built the road, they knocked down the church. They're not the church, but not the mosque. It's kind of interesting. But nobody had the guts to bulldoze the altar. So the altar is now standing there all by itself on the side of the road. Kids use it's a great place for jumping off, Anyhow, so economic inequality, I'm not going to present a lot of data on this, just simply to make the point to you. This is sacks of maize harvested 2010. This is the sacks, and this is the number of people, and this is the number of sacks. And any sort of distribution which has a long tail to the right, is a strong indicator of very high levels of inequality. If you don't like thinking about sacks of maize, but you want to think about stuff, a cash value of the kind of stuff people now have, modern stuff people have in their houses, you get this same kind of distribution. And this leads to a Gini index, the Gini coefficient, which varies between 0 and 1 as an indicator of 0, everybody has the same, 1 person has everything. You can see that the Pimbwe Gini for material wealth is about 0.35. Well, the Pimbwe are horticulturalists, so they're pretty much higher than, this was from our sample in our science paper, they're pretty much up there. So they're, at least in terms of material wealth, they're getting to be pretty unequal. Okay, so turning now, that's the background. Now turning to how does cooperation vary as a function of material wealth. What did we know about cooperation in the village? Well, there's very little apparent evidence of any sharing of food or labor. From basically 10, 15 years of field work, 2 or 3 students working there, we were just unable to uncover any cooperation at all. And that's this kind of principle that the Pimbwe have of being independent, doing everything for yourself, not depending on anybody else. And so we thought, well, maybe they just don't want to report it. But it kind of went together with Brian and Craig did work on, they did these ultimatum games, and we found extremely low levels of pro-sociality, low offers and high rejection rates. We think part of this is to do with very weak third-party institutions. If you get into a dispute or trouble with anybody in Mpimbwe, the first thing you resort to is either gossip or violence yeah, I mean, basically those are the 2 things. The last thing that you will do is go to the village government, which you saw the picture of. Nobody really respects or trusts the village elders to adjudicate anything fairly. So people kind of have to do everything for themselves. They resort to their own resources. There's also a lot of conflict within households. I know this from all my work on divorce. And there is still husbands stealing from wives, wives stealing from husbands, just horrible cases. And I put this picture of this lady who's blind. People steal from blind people. Like this woman, the hand in there is not somebody stealing, I assure you. I wouldn't have taken a photo of that. But I put it there just to kind of, remind me that just horrible, horrible things go on. There's really not much pro-sociality at all. And the Pimbwe are totally aware of this. They say, they compare themselves to all the tribes around, and we're stingy, we're horrible. And when things go wrong, you sort of say, oh, why did that happen? How can I help you? Well, how can we sort this problem out? And I'm doing this a lot with the conservation work and the land grab works that I adjudicate a lot on these issues. You say, how can we sort this out? And they look and say, we're Pimbwe. And it's like that's an explanation for things not working and for people being stingy and unhelpful. And it's really rough, I have to tell you. So we decided, despite all of this, to do a study of helping. I was convinced something was going on. Here's the team, Emily, my postdoc, and two village assistants. Very briefly, I'm going to tell you what we did. We looked at individuals, not households. We have to do that because think of all the stealing that goes on within households. It just doesn't work to ask questions about you as a household. We had a wide, because so little help does occur, we asked questions about all sorts of things. Who did you get food from? Whose kids did you look after? Who did you borrow money from? Who did you borrow a bicycle from? Who did you help with so-and-so? With such and such thing, we had about 11 different tasks. Who did you bring firewood for? And because we knew that we sort of had to try and cover as many domains as possible. Now, this is analytically problematic to have a lot of different domains. On the other hand, I kind of get frustrated by studies of cooperation when people just look at food and say, oh, there is reciprocity or there isn't. We know that humans trade across so many different domains. There is some power to this approach of covering all these different domains. I really covered every domain that I could think of that was important. So they ask across all these different domains, and then for our measure of helping scope, which is going to be kind of the measure here, we simply summed across, did they say yes in this domain, did they say yes in this domain, did they say yes in this domain, across the 10 or 11 different domains, and summed them. And so our measure of helping scope is the number of domains in which you helped somebody, your dyad.
Did you try to analyze them separately then?
There were so many zeros. You're going to see we turn somersaults here to deal with zeros. So no, I mean, I would like to, but no, we didn't. And then we used, we asked people both about, did I lend you a bike or did I, give you some money over different periods of time, obviously depending on the question. And then we also asked, did he give any to you? And so or did anybody give any to you? So we kind of tried to adjudicate from both sides and use this union matrix that actually Dave Nolan developed. It's a nice method for trying to sort of look at the validity of your data. This is work in progress with Casper. Claudia Casper did most of the analysis. She was an assistant to me when I was living in Berlin last year. Unfortunately, I don't have a photo of her. So here's the village. This is kind of funny. This is a Google shot from 2001 or 2002. It's incredibly clear because there was a lot of Al-Qaeda activity, Al-Qaeda recruiting going on in this western part of Tanzania. And so we're sure that Google got told to sharpen up here. And so it's an amazingly good picture. The one problem is they call it Usavia. Usavia is a town about 18 kilometers away. So if any CIA agent, ground man came to check out what was going on, he'd get all kind of confused. Anyhow, this is Mpimbwe, my village, before the big road really destroyed it. And we did our helping study in Ntakula, which is the southern part, south of the road. We collected data on with 136 different interviews, 85 men, 51 women. You can see the age ranges. On individuals, we used my demographic data for gender, age, or a wealth measure, which is just a sum of assets. And we also had an indicator of household need, which is kind of consumer-producer ratios. And then between individuals, between nodes, we had obviously the geographic distance based on GPS. We had kinship relatedness. And yeah, that's it. And so at the bottom here, you see this is just from the program we used. Actually, these 3 points were wrong. We're still rerunning it one more time. And here you can see the individuals are either connected or not through a helping line or no line. And the kind of gap in the middle is the school.
So that's just binary on any of your criteria somebody helped?
Yeah, this is just all thrown together, and there's no information in there other than whether there was a connection or not. And so the the first thing is what we found, there's very little help confirming the qualitative observations, lots and lots of matrices full of zeros. The second question that I'm actually not going to talk about in detail, I will show you just one result, but the big question in the food sharing literature that's really obsessed people is what maintains cooperative behavior? Is it kin selection or reciprocal altruism? Kin selection being that everything else equal, you're more likely to pick a donor, pick a recipient of somebody who's closely related as a function of little r. And reciprocal altruism is that you're more likely to direct help to somebody who is more likely to reciprocate that assistance. And that, of course, can only be based on a past history of reciprocation. And so that measure is called contingency. I'm going to talk about contingency quite a lot. And you can see that are studies of some of the key, very nice work that has been done. And what people have found is basically that both kin selection and reciprocal altruism are important, which is not really surprising. And it's what we find too. So these are results that literally Claudia sent to me yesterday. We'd had to rerun everything because we had a few technical problems. There's an awful lot in here. Let me try and make it as simple as possible. There it is. Our measures here are distance, geographic distance, contingency, which is the probability of sharing in the past, relatedness, little r. And these are different models with their AIC scores. So the lowest, of course, is the best. MR-QAP is... if you're I'm sure most of you know this, if you're analyzing social network data, you've got all these problems of lack of independence between observations, and there's a whole lot of methodologies now across different disciplines, actually, as to how to deal with this. We use something, UCINet has a program that you can run these, QAP, quadratic assignment procedure, which they have on UCINet. They actually don't have it with a Poisson distribution, so David Nolan sort of kindly hacked into it and sort of managed to get a Poisson into it. I have no idea how he did it, but it was very clever. And it deals better with the zeros. And then MR is multiple regression, right, that you've got more than one predictive variable. And so here are our variables. We've got two kinds of models, and I don't want to go into this in big detail because it's not really what I'm talking about today, but it gives you a sense of the data. We've got two sets of models, these models which are called C, which are really just only got three terms in distance, contingency, and relatedness. And then we've got models that we call E, extended models, and that has different measures of relatedness and contingency. And these are kind of cool, measuring relatedness, not just in terms of little r, but how does relatedness affect helping as a function of both need and the need of the family, and a unidirectional transmission, right? Because you would only help somebody who's more needy than you. So this is a way of trying to get at the B's and C's in Hamilton's model. So in some of the models, we replace this R with this R, which we think is a better way of measuring sort of recipient need. And then this is another way of thinking about contingency, which is R times C. And the idea here is that contingency will affect helping scope, the amount of help that you give, more or less when you're dealing with a relative. So that there's either a kind of positive association between contingency and relatedness or a negative one. And so the main point to, if all of this is a bit confusing, but the main point to draw away from it is, yes, households that are closer cooperate more, or at least if they're more distant away from each other, their helping scope is less. Contingency means, yes, people who have helped you in the past, you're more likely to have a high helping scope with them now. And relatedness, yes, has the kind of positive effect that you would expect. Again, in these extended models, relatedness is always positive. This R times C is kind of really confusing, and I'd love to come back to it at the end and get people's input, because I know there are people here who think about these sorts of variables. Generally, we're finding that as Hamilton and Axelrod and Boyd and McElrath and Boyd and other people have, argued a lot, that in choosing people with whom you want to reciprocate in the future, kin are going to be particularly good choices, right? Because you know if they're reliable people, you know the kind of people who will respond to you. You can normally find them more easily. So they're good people to choose. And so you may be interacting with them with more, not as a result of inclusive fitness considerations, but as a result of reciprocal altruism. And so that's what all these positive covariations, interaction effects are basically showing. What this suggests is kind of the opposite, that you're more forgiving of unequal, of reciprocity, right, more forgiving of people who don't give back to you, even if you've given to them when you're related to them. And it's confusing. I'm going to come back to this, but I just wanted to sort of show you these are the data at the moment. But right, to go on to the sort of main point of the talk, which is, what is the patterning? Why are people helping or giving different helping scopes? Why is there variation in helping scope? So how is this patterned by gender, age, need, kin relatedness, and wealth? And here you've got the sort of main result here. This is what we were already looking at, actually in a slightly earlier configuration of the model, so the values aren't exactly the same, but basically contingency is positive, relatedness is positive, and distance is negative. Here are the variables in green are kind of controls for the moment, but it does turn out that indeed educated people receive more. Age is kind of interesting. Older people give more, older people receive less, and closely aged people help more. And this just captures everything you see in Mpimbwe. You saw the little old blind lady. There are so many people, old people in Mpimbwe, who are completely ignored by their kin. The need, I don't know what's happened here. The figures haven't come out. Anyhow, basically it's what you'd expect. Needy people are given more and give less, and receive more. But what I'm really, the results I want to talk about today is this wealth effect. So wealthy people give less and they receive less. Very straightforward, simple result. That wealthy people are just not giving as much or receiving as much. And this is just an Excel, plotting of the data. This is obviously not how we analyzed it. But what you can see here, both the absolute number of help given and the absolute number of help received and given. If you divide the population into terciles, you see that the rich basically receive less than do people in the middle or the poor terciles of the population. And when you look at giving, the same thing. The rich give less than do the middle or do the poor. And so the kind of story I take away from this is that rich are withdrawing from cooperation. They're trying to consolidate their wealth. and they're trying to insulate themselves from the demands of the poor. And you should think about all of this in terms of the beginnings of cash cropping, people getting some money, cash, rather than the classics of African wealth in people, that they're just kind of putting money under their beds and and withdrawing from the kind of village sort of cooperative network. I say cooperative network kind of, they weren't super cooperative as you've seen, but there is some cooperation going on. Oh, yeah, and this is just a kind of story to capture it. This is a totally different project we're doing on trying to work with lion killers of a different ethnicity who are causing a lot of trouble in the national park at the moment. And this is a guy who we hired to run this project. And, when he first arrived, I sort of said, welcome, feel at home. It's difficult he's an educated Tanzanian, but it's kind of odd to be in a house of, researchers from America, and he kind of felt uncomfortable. I kept saying, feel at home, please, make yourself at home. And, he kind of grinned at me and, put up with my odd ways. And about, a week or two later, he said, Monique, last thing you want to say to somebody, to make them feel at home is to say feel at home. Because, he has to go back home to his family in Arusha, and they're demanding money for this, money for that, everything, And he says the last place you want to go, if a relative dies and you have to go home, you just dread it because you're going to have to give so much. So he said, never say feel at home to a Tanzanian. After, 20 years of having worked there, I felt really small. I thought I'd understood things. Anyhow, so now I'm moving from cooperation, this is a much easier section of the talk, to conflict. And I'm studying conflict through cases of witchcraft, and how does this vary as a function of material wealth? You can imagine what my expectations are here. So just a little bit about witchcraft. It's in the African context, we think of witchcraft as the ascription of misfortune to the malevolent or covert actions of others. This is a classic definition, actually, amongst anthropologists. And it really derives from this idea that getting rich is a form of predation. And if Joe's got something which I haven't got, if Joe's doing well, it's because he's taken something from me. There's just not this idea that there's good for everyone to go around. It's, you guys have got it, I don't have it. You've taken something from me. Or if I get, something nice happens to me tomorrow, he's going to just immediately feel that I stole it from him. There's only enough good to go around, or there isn't enough good to go around, and we're sharing it. It's like a kind of zero-sum game. And this was a concept that Foster used to talking about peasants in Central America, but it's also been applied by Sanders to this idea of witchcraft across Africa, and it's really the right way of thinking about it. It just captures Mpimbwe entirely. And it operates as a pressure gauge for wealth differences. So the poor use witchcraft to kind of challenge the rich or to harass the rich, whereas the rich use it to kind of try to legitimize their power or to deter rivals. So, and again, this is stuff done looking at witchcraft by Conant all over Africa. And it persists to this day with a weird sort of blending of modern and traditional forms. So this is a baby's bottle, which nobody uses, but it's seen as a very powerful emblem. It's got this feather stuck on it, and this was a key piece of evidence in a court case that was going on in the village over a witchcraft accusation. And nobody would touch this. I mean, it's just like seen as a really, really dangerous item, and it's this weird blend of modernism. This is the house of one of the very a witch doctor. Witch doctor is somebody who finds witches rather than is a witch, right? It's different. This is his shrine for trying to work out what's going on, doing his science. And I don't have time to talk about this. I just put it up to show that witchcraft is all over Tanzania. It's in the government. It's with these terrible albino killings. It's in the taxi services in Dar es Salaam. Every bus has a little bucket under the back seat to collect the blood after an accident, because then you can give that blood to a spirit to protect you. Not you, the bus driver, right? To protect him against the attacks that will be made on him for having led them into an accident. It's horrible. And this is a killing of lions that are believed to carry spirits, and witchcraft is involved in all kinds of development projects. We've found out sometimes to our cost. Witchcraft in Mpimbwe is driven by slightly different kinds of things, poor hive harvest, child death, HIV, multi-party politics is a big thing now. Microloan schemes are being often unraveling as a result of these accusations. Here's a really sad picture. They have a case against their son-in-law who they're accusing of having killed their daughter. The daughter is the mum of this kid they're now looking after, and of having impregnated their younger daughter. This is just how life is in Mpimbwe. But and so I collected data on this. I never actually did it kind of formally, but it was sort of one of these field notebook things that whenever a case is going on, I would write down and find out as much about it. And I finally decided from my 12 different study periods to put together all the cases I had. So it's 57 independent cases with 75 individuals living in the village. This is between those dates. And here you can see that it's declining, but not exactly fast, and there's still a lot of witchcraft going on. And this is likely an underestimate as well, because it was not a systematic focus of data collection. It still persists. And the interesting thing is, this is a very simple kind of figure, but just showing that when you split the population, again, on the asset scores, the individuals in witchcraft cases tend to come from the wealthiest classes. Sorry? Yeah, sorry, I didn't make that clear. I run together accusers and accused because it's like amongst your friends here, who's the divorcer and who's the divorced? I just, even with your best friends, you don't know, right? And it's the same. I don't try and get in. I have an intuition, and some people tell me some things, but do I really trust them? It's people involved in. It's really the only way I can. Even that son-in-law who was being bewitched who was being accused of having bewitched the daughter and killed her. The other neighbors said, oh, these grandparents were just being so horrible to him, they weren't giving him any land to farm on, and that they were really the causes of it. So, hard to unravel. And here, no, I missed a slide there, I think. There should be, oh yeah, no, oh, how weird. Okay. Oh, no, that's okay. All right, sorry. So both of the studies I've shown, both of helping networks and witchcraft, show that the rich are less cooperative than the poor. It's a really simple message from this. But what I want to end up with here is that the kin are not immune from being disregarded by the rich. And actually, the wealthy seem to be behaving particularly nastily to their kin. And so I'm just going to go back to the same two studies, basically. And what I've done here, this is the data you saw before for help given and help received. This is this helping scope measure that we were using. And now it's done as proportions, not absolute amounts. So the bars look the same height. But what we've got here is four different categories of relatedness. We've got, this is basically 0.5, 0.25, less than 0.25, and then these are completely unrelated people. And what you can see is that the rich are really focusing, this is help received and help given, they're really focusing on their very, very closest kin. And even 0.25, so you can see here, I had it written here, the very close of father's mother, son's daughter, and then the closer, mother's mother, mother's father, father's mothers, father's fathers, brothers and sisters. So even people in this second category of just close are starting to appear like they're not being helped as much, and the same with the giving and the receiving. Whereas this is not happening with the middle and the poor categories. So the kind of message I haven't done any statistics on this because there's just too many interacting variables, so I'm not quite sure how to go ahead with this. This is just a plotting of the data. But wealthy individuals not only receive and give less help than poor individuals, but they also reduce the span of kin with whom they cooperate. So they're kind of narrowing in onto these really close relatives. And when you look at the witchcraft stuff, so now I'm into the second study, first of all, this is just all the data, and you can see that these are all the cases. Well, the most number of cases are with unrelated people. But if you look at this mother, father, daughter, son, and then you look at the sibs and the grandparents, and you look at the close bilateral, and then you look at the distant bilateral, and then spouses, you know, if you put all of these together, or even without the spouses, they'd be more numerous than the unrelated cases. So there's an awful lot of witchcraft going on amongst relatives. And this was actually one of my collaborators in the university, Simio Masaki, works on witchcraft in northern Tanzania. And he says one of the most surprising things is that the attacks often originate from the victim's family. And he says surprising because he's writing for an English newspaper in Dar es Salaam, but this would not be surprising to any Tanzanian, you know. I'm like that guy Peter I showed the picture of who's doing the lion killing project. You know, as you go back to your family in Arusha or wherever and you don't bring stuff, you know, you're likely that somebody will do something nasty to you if you don't help them. So there's this whole idea of kind of breaking sort of normative expectations amongst kin. And so here you can see these witchcraft cases now broken down by relatedness and wealth, and you can see that the number of individuals in witchcraft cases is in the high tercile. There are many more related than unrelated, whereas the difference is certainly there's no clear difference here with the low wealth, in the low wealth tercile. So wealthy people seem to be directing accusations against their relatives. And just to, I didn't say at the very beginning when I had that picture of witchcraft, this family, I wanted to say this is a family who've been excommunicated from the village of Mpimbwe. And I just tell you the story about it, it makes it very clear. She is an amazing lady, incredibly productive, a super farmer, very organized, very strong. She, this is several years ago now, but there was a lot of food shortage in the village, and her husband's sister came to see her and requested help for food. And she said no, because she's got a lot of people living in this family, a lot of grandchildren. She just said, there's too many people to look after. I can't do it. I can't help them. I'm not going to give you any of my millet or any of my maize. 3 weeks later, that husband's sister's son, who was like an 18 or 19-year-old, died. He got malaria, he got cerebral malaria. He went to see a traditional healer. He went out in the night, I think just to sort of go to the bathroom, and he disappeared. And 3 days later, we found him, most of him having been eaten by a hyena. It was horrible. And this was immediately led to the husband's sister, this woman's husband's sister, mounting an accusation against her. Their house was burnt down in the middle of the night. One of her daughters is one of my assistants, and she just had a little baby, and they got stoned as they ran out of the house. And now, as a result, they live outside of the village, and they're still living outside there. So this was kind of, it just turned into such a nasty case because she had not responded to a kinship request. This was sort of the norm that had been broken here. So I'm finishing. What time is it? I'm doing okay. So as I said, I kind of come back to this, and I put this kind of more theoretical or more sort of interpretive ending to this at the end of the talk now, because on a lot of these issues I'm kind of confused. I'm confused analytically, I'm confused theoretically, and I'd love this to open up to more of a discussion. The stuff on kinship is, well, to some extent is very straightforward. I mean, remember, you know, there were always positive coefficients of R on helping scope, which is what, you know, we would expect following Hamilton 64, you know, that kin preferentially cooperate. That's all okay, that's straightforward. We also found, you remember when I showed you the figure with the R times C interaction effect between contingency and relatedness, we found that in most of the models, although not in one of them, we found that you're more likely to your helping scope is positively affected by contingency, but is even more strongly affected by contingency. That's a history of sharing in the past, if you're relatives. So this is kind of what Axelrod and Hamilton were on in that horrible, what's the word? Appendix to their paper, and something expanded a lot in Richard and Rob's book, and also a recent paper in AmNat, that, you know, as I mentioned before, if you're looking for people to enter into cooperative relationships with, tit-for-tat relationships, it's better to do it with kin because you can find them, you probably trust them, you know which ones to avoid, which ones not. They're basically a good bet. And so most of those positive RCs, R times C effects on helping scope make very good sense in terms of this kind of theoretical way of thinking. The one negative one really confuses me. It means that, but it confuses me and it doesn't confuse me. What it means is that how you could construe it is that you're more tolerant of imbalances with kin than non-kin. Well, as an anthropologist, right, I mean, we've got Salins long ago, right, tells us this, we shouldn't forget that kin are forgiving, we have this concept of generalized reciprocity, and that kin are more forgiving of relatives who don't help them or who don't pay them back than they are of strangers. And it's also kind of consistent with Brosnan's recent overview of inequality aversion in non-human primates, where she finds there's much more evidence of IA, inequality aversion, among non-related non-human primates than amongst related human primates. And I suppose we could always also sort of think of it as consistent with Joe et al.'s results with respect to market integration. They found basically people were more cooperative in the populations where people were more used to dealing with strangers. And so it just seems to me, I'm afraid this is kind of really a weak way of summarizing it, but it just seems to me there's a kind of a murky area here between sort of how kin, about the relationship between kin and reciprocity, about sort of whether you would expect it to be positive, that people would be more demanding of their kin or less demanding of their kin, or more like, the causality issue here. You might be less demanding of your kin to enter into equal relationships, but at the same time you may be more keen to enter into reciprocal relationships with your kin because you can find them in the future. So we need data over time, and that's extremely difficult to get. We've talked about this a little bit earlier this morning, but there's kind of issues here that I would just love your input in. And then there's this final result, the witch withdrawing, with respect to kinship, the witch withdrawing from kin who are related less than 0.25. And this, I think, makes pretty good sense in terms of local resource competition models. There's a lot of empirical work now being done by anthropologists, finding, looking at birth order effects and same-sex conflict in terms of inheritance rules, cooperation, finding that where kin are competing for their parents' resources, you'll often get extremely intense competition. And so I'm obviously looking at it in a different way, but maybe it's in these wealthy families. Remember, these families are really nucleated, so, Joe and I might be a couple. Where's Susan, by the way? Joe and I might... Joe, I saw her last week, so I was hoping to see her. She's certainly not here. Joe and I might be a couple. We might be doing really well. But his brother is Dan, and Dan's married to Brooke, and they're having a really rotten time. And even though you two are brothers,
Crummy farmer,
I bet she is, exactly. But so there's no correlation between Joe's wealth and Dan's wealth, or between Brooke and her sisters, or something like that. So compared to populations I've worked with before, where you have corporate wealth holding by lineages, if Joe's wealthy, Dan's going to be wealthy, and Brooke and I will probably both be wealthiest because we're married to two brothers who are doing well. And so you have this total nucleation of the wealth. It's basically under people's beds practically. And so it means that somebody who's a close kin, they have these traditional, conventional demands on you, like we're sisters, but hey, I'm married to this really rich guy and you're married to this lousy guy, and I'm damned if I'm going to help you, So I think that's kind of what's going on here. It's an interesting development. And my last slide is just coming back to the overall. So I was talking about the kin wealth effects, and now I'm just talking about the overall wealth effect. The standard economist expectation that you'll get more cooperation amongst the poor than the rich because of marginal returns, buffering yourself against risk, food sharing, all the kind of stuff I reviewed at the beginning, is a kind of a weak model, right? I mean, we haven't measured any of the marginal returns of the benefits to sharing, and even in the kind of conventional food sharing literature, sort of Mike Girvin's stuff, they mount this model, but they never actually look and see whether people who are closer to the line of starvation are in fact more likely to share. And there are actually reasons sometimes why you wouldn't be more likely to share. So I think this is a super under-theorized area. But I mean, I put a minus there. And despite my criticism of the theory, in fact, it is kind of starting to look like a pattern that the wealthier are meaner than the poor in terms of prosociality. There's a great paper in PNAS, I don't know if anybody's seen this, by Piff et al., where it basically done on experiments and quasi-naturalist experiments in the US, where people of high SES are just horrible. I mean, you leave a dollar note on the street and, a poor or homeless person will pick it up and, take it to the police station almost, whereas the rich never do that, and they're more likely to kind of knock people off their bikes, and it's an incredible paper. I don't know how much of it is really generalizable, but so they argue that there's a lot more kind of ethical behavior and pro-social behavior amongst poorer people than richer people in the US. David Nolan has a recent paper in La Malera where he finds that whereas leaders are more pro-social than non-leaders, the wealthy actually give a lot less in terms of food than do the poor, although interestingly they receive more, so they're probably playing some kind of patron-client relationship, which we don't see in Mpimbwe. Kenyan farmers, there's recent stuff showing that as people get wealthier, and particularly as they get private plots, they tend to withdraw from cooperative labor institutions. So again, the same thing, this negative relation. And then this kind of really weird case in the Ugandans, the famous Ick case, Turnbull's work, describing cases where people who were, this was in a terrible case of famine, of people actually kind of similar to the Pimbwe who'd been thrown out of a national park, who were, he has these ethnographic observations of the people who were quote unquote lucky enough to have some crops in the fields actually would destroy them or leave them to rot in the fields rather than bringing that back to the village because they didn't want to incur the danger of having enough to share. So this is kind of an example again of just sort of, bringing in your observation or your obligations to other people. So I think we're starting to see a pattern here that rich people are mean, which is kind of fine by me, but I don't think that we have good theory to explain why, and I don't think we have enough empirical information. I don't think any of us anthropologists have really analyzed our data, these kinds of social network analyses at the individual level enough to say anything very solid yet. The political science stuff, remember that was the Ostrom model. The argument there was actually the rich people or the most powerful people contribute most to collective goods in the community because basically the cost to them are the least, or because they have more stake in the community kind of ongoing stability. We really found no evidence that the rich were doing anything for anybody else, and so that is clearly not what's driving what we're seeing in Mpimbwe. And then the evolutionary biology model, I remember I talked about costly signaling, and that people who are doing well may want to sort of signal their success by being generous, by being kind of nice guys, like sort of the chiefs a bit in Fiji that we're talking about this morning. Absolutely no evidence of that in Mpimbwe at all. The rich people are hunkering down. And so what we really, as behavioral ecologists, need to do is to explore why do we have these very, very different responses to globalization. And these responses, of course, going to drive local variation in levels of inequality. And that brings me back to the beginning, so I'll stop. Thanks. Yep.
So you're saying that rich people are mean, but is it possible that it's just that mean people get rich? In the sense that in order to actually accumulate wealth, you have to first be willing to reject requests of help. I mean, It sounds like everyone is kind of doing that. So.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Actually, I had another slide which I took out for length about some of the issues we need to think about with it. Causality is part of it. I would not want to. I think it's got to be this ratcheting thing that you do a little bit well, maybe by chance, you get a good harvest. It just leads you maybe to reject a few requests people make, leads you to withdraw a little bit. You've got a little bit more security because you've got some money under the bed, or well, I say money under the bed, it's more food in your store. And so it might drive you to become richer because you're giving less out, but it might also promote you then. This is a co-evolutionary process.
And is part of that process that as people get more wealth, then more people come and ask them for things, or do you think it's still
Yes.
the immediate?
I'm absolutely sure that happens, and of course, saying that as an ethnographer, I'm probably the wealthiest person in the village, and yeah, I mean, as I said at the beginning, working here really has been horrible, and I'm not the kind of person who normally, I normally love my fieldwork. I've done it like for 30 years, and so it's obvious I like the life, but we were just so in demand, requests all the time, and it was very, very hard to deal with it. So I kind of do sympathize with these people. They are getting, somebody does well and everybody flocks around trying to get some of their good, because somehow that should be the good for everybody. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, there's a little sideline here, but it's a bit of a, it partly drove me into doing much more, I do much more applied work. I do a lot of applied medical stuff now and all the conservation work. And it's all really working on sort of integrated development projects in the area. And I thought by doing that, it was a way of kind of, I mean, here's me talking like a rich Pimbwe, trying to protect myself from these constant demands. And, so when people come, I say, look, we've got this school program going, we've got this program, we're working with your chiefs to do this, we're working with your political leaders to do that, always trying to work on different projects. And it actually hasn't, I thought it would help. It's actually made me even more of a target, because I'm now considered to be not just rich, but also powerful. And, it's just everything an ethnographer doesn't want to be, so don't make the mistake I made. Yeah, he was like...
So first kind of a theoretical clarifying point, and then maybe ask you to speculate a little bit about how they got into this predicament. And the clarifying point is with regard to the costly signaling argument. So Smith and Leedy Bird argue that, and I think it's cogent, that being pro-social is only useful as a costly signal versus other ways of costly signaling, because it has better broadcast efficiency. That is, people pay attention,
right.
If there's stuff in it for them, and so they're watching, and so they learn things about you that they wouldn't learn otherwise, right? But the parallel literature in economics on conspicuous consumption doesn't address that, because many kind of prestige goods inherently have broadcast efficiency, right? So if you have a satellite dish on the top of your house,
yes,
everybody knows.
You're broadcasting.
You don't have to slaughter a cow in order to get everyone's attention, right? Or bring in a turtle or whatever it is, right? Because your reputation is self-evident.
Right. There's no hidden quality here.
So there's nothing about costly signaling that requires that people be pro-social in order to signal.
I agree.
If there's good broadcast efficiency in other expenditures, and the photo of the house that you showed, it's quite clear, right? Anybody who walks by knows, and so on. So I don't think you can kind of shove that out of the way as a potential explanation. It's just that it doesn't apply to pro-social.
Yeah, you can't use it, to say that the costly signaling doesn't, it's not relevant to this situation, but the fact that people they may have hidden qualities as well. You're quite totally right, the satellite dish is totally obvious, but there may be hidden qualities as well that they may want to demonstrate. If it's a hidden quality, it's costly, and to be costly, you've got to, your way of showing it has got to be costly, and they could do that. What I'm saying is that they could do it, and there is actually, there's a whole history of chieftainships in Mpimbwe, and they could kind of. I mean, I was talking with some of the Fiji staff today, and the way that chiefly image is sort of being maintained, they could be doing that, and they're not.
Yeah, so that actually brings me to my question, where I ask you to speculate a little bit. So, you're ending with mentioning the ick is I think apropos, because Bob Edgerton wrote this book, fairly controversial
Six
book,
Societies.
Six Societies, right? and one way of thinking about six societies from an evolutionary perspective is that they're stuck in a negative equilibrium somehow, right? They can't climb out, and that we would expect over time cultural evolution will eliminate them, right? Because they'll either be displaced or conquered or assimilated by better organized groups that are more successful at generating the mutualisms that lead to success. So the question then is, how do people get into these predicaments, right? And I'm extrapolating here from guesses that I have about the folks that I work with in Sumatra, where there's some parallels. And one possibility, it seems to me, is that if you have cooperative norms that are closely tied to subsistence, so for example, if you have hunters or fishers or people like that, where we have a rule which is you have to share the meat, okay,
right.
or the fish, and I can tell when you have the meat or the fish, right?
Yep.
Then that tends to level things out reasonably well. Once you have a market economy, then you have wealth that can be hidden, essentially. That is, people can't tell what your daily income is.
Right.
And if the norms are closely tied to subsistence to start with, then people can say, well, this isn't a fish, right? I mean, this is, right? So in Bengkulu, people are always accusing each other of hiding money, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have stuff and you're not giving it to me, you should give it to me. I would know if you had food, but I don't know if you have money.
Yeah.
Right? I suspect that you have money and you're not sharing it with me. Right? So I'm wondering whether, I realize that you weren't there, that you're guessing about the past, but whether you think the problem that they're in now is that their norms weren't tied to sort of what you might think of as motive or relationship, right? So you need to show you care, or this is how you treat people in this particular relationship. But instead, they were tied to the
resources,
stuff, right?
Yeah.
This is what you're supposed to do with this stuff.
Yeah.
And when you don't have that stuff anymore because you've been pushed out by a
You don't trigger that response, yeah.
Then then it's my stuff, and you don't get any, right?
Yeah, yeah. That's interesting. It's kind of. I suppose I had a slightly different hypothesis, and that it was to do simply with I post hoc spin a hypothesis. There's not a hypothesis before, but that it's to do with the extent you can privatize wealth. So it's still, I think, I'm a materialist through and through, and I think thinking about it in terms of the resources is absolutely key. And when, the Pimbwe do still hunt, and when somebody comes back with an animal, there are still a lot of demands on him to share. And when we did this book on the history, we talked to all the old guys, and we heard about these kind of collective areas in the village where everybody would come together and cook the hunted meat together. And so, there was that. So the argument you're making, though, right now, so meat is not so common, it doesn't trigger the response, is a possible one. It's an interesting one because it points to a certain mechanism. My view is still that it's to do with the resource, but it's to do with the resource that you can hide so easily. Yeah. And so meat and fish, well, actually fish were less widely shared. Meat was very widely shared because it's really hard to hide. Well, now it's mainly millet and maize, and you're right, you don't have any of the daily variability, but people know the size of your store, and people harvest in July, and that stuff has got to get you all the way through, and everybody can see who's got a store and who hasn't. And by the way, the stores are often divided between a husband and wife, even with a lock, because the husband's maybe using it to sell for people to brew for beer, so he gets cash, and it's incredible. But so everybody knows what's going on, and they know how much is in each granary. So I think it might be, I think it's an interesting line to pursue, whether it's the change in resources, so you've got a domain where there was cooperation, now we've moved to a domain where there wasn't, or whether it's a different nature of resource. Well, how can we tease that out?
So my point is that when you're in the ancestral hunting state for this particular community, if you will, right? It doesn't matter whether the norms are tied to relationships or tied to meat, right? That is, they can produce the same positive equilibrium of cooperation. Right? But if they're tied to the resource and not to the relationship, then you move to a different resource.
Right. So then the relationship is lost.
Right. You can imagine that there are societies that transition very well to market economies because the norms are about how you treat one another and not how you treat the stuff that is mediating the relationship.
That's right. That's right. But I think that's right. But I think that my data point to the fact that it is tied to the resources.
I think that's right.
Yeah. And just one final thing about populations like this not being at equilibrium. I thought a lot about six societies because I'm sort of living in one. It is not stable, and there's a population of Sukuma, who are these agro-pastoralists who are moving down from northern Tanzania. The new census has just come out. They're more than 50% of the population of the Rukwa Valley. The lion killer you saw, the two lion killer guys you saw are of the Sukuma, and they are completely displacing Pimbwe. The woman I showed who was in a witchcraft case who didn't help her husband's sister. She now, when I went to go and see her, she's still living right outside the village. I wasn't allowed to see her for 10 years because I had my son in the field, and everybody said, Monique, if you take your son, he will die if you go and see her. You mustn't go. And I adored her, and so finally when my son was like robust enough, I thought, yeah, it's not true enough, but even I was nervous when he was small. So then I went to go and see her, and I noticed that she's using, for her relationship terms with kin, she's using the Sukuma language, not the Pimbwe language. And so what's happening is this population is just going to move, they're all going to be Sukuma. That's why we're doing the book, is to try to, save something of the Pimbwe. Anyhow, sorry, it's a long answer. Claude?
Yeah, you had said that you thought that the findings were in some ways consistent with Henrik's stuff, and I was actually thinking the opposite, at least sort of on face value. I mean, at least one interpretation of the cross-cultural findings was that capitalism makes you nicer.
Yep.
Right? That being familiar with market norms gives you the ability to interact with strangers in a cooperative way. And so, at least at the first pass, you'd think, and this goes for the stuff you're showing up there too, the PIF and all that. At first pass, you'd think rich people are the people who have mastered market norms more, and therefore you would expect them to be better able to cooperate with non-kin. And it seems like this is the reverse. I was wondering if you had any thoughts.
Yeah, let me try to... I agree with you. I have to say I've been back and forth on this. As I said, I put the stuff up at the end because I am confused. I did have a logic. So inequality aversion's an odd thing, I realize, as I think about it. You can think about it that you're you're monitoring. There's two things going on with inequality aversion. You might be willing to accept inequality because, hey, I'm related to this person, and even though she doesn't help me back, no problem, I'm going to totally accept the kind of silence position. Or it could be that I'm not tolerant of inequality because I want to police. I want to police free riders, which is the argument, I think, which was going on with Henrik's, right? That you're more alert you're more fair because you don't want to get seen as a free rider because you're trying to move into this market economy. And this, I'm thankful you asked that, because this is what's really confusing me about how we deal with this our time C thing, how we deal with inequality, we're poorly reciprocated relationships. It could be that if you don't have them, it could be two things. It could be that you're not forgiving, you're a bastard, you just move away. Or it could be that you're trying to demonstrate that you're a really nice person because you're willing to punish other people who don't accept it. And so there's something really wrong with that concept. For thinking with, sort of Levi-Strauss, good to think with kind of things, in that it's not helping us tease stuff out here. And if you go back to I won't go back to it, but that awful, actually maybe I will, because there's really so much in here, if you'll allow me to. Ooh, no, I did something really silly there, didn't I? Oh, and I've ended up at the beginning again, that's great. And I go back to that result that Claudia just sent me yesterday morning, and it was here, right. This is, I should put it bigger, shouldn't I? What did I do wrong? I'm not a Mac user. Okay, and then how do I... Sorry, I'm an old PC person. Oh yeah, I should recognize that, sorry. Okay. No, we didn't have it, I'm sorry. But I think it is worth putting it up because, it's this one. This R times C term is like, so what we've done here, I think Claudia did something naughty. Well, I shouldn't actually, I think this is wrong because, when you compare AIC models, they've all got to be run with the same variables going in there. And I think when she uses our extended model variables, they're actually not run in the same competition as when we're using our straight C and straight R. Because if you see that, we used to have them in two separate tables. That's what's kind of confusing here. But so I don't know if all of these AIC values are completely comparable, but if you'll just forgive me that for the moment. What seems to happen, what is happening here, normally you're getting R by C interaction, which again is that you're more, you have a bigger helping contingency has a bigger effect on helping scope in the presence of relatedness. So you're kind of cooperating a lot with your kin. But here we get this is, because it's below 1, it's actually a negative interaction effect. And this is kind of the Salin's point, right? That you're more willing to accept unequal relationships with your kin. Now there's something wrong here.
The R by C, does that control for frequency of interaction? Because you might think that you might get more contingency with kin if you just interact more with them.
Well, everything is controlled for availability in the community, because this is all, it's all within a social network model. That's kind of, I think all the basic steps we have are right about what you need. I think this is pretty much what it says it is. And I mean, it's obviously something to do with what else is in the model, and clearly it's because this contingency is such a high term. It's.
But there's also so there's no R in any of the other.
Well, it won't be a straight in any of the what? There should be R in all of the E models.
Any of the 3 that are positive, they don't have R's or C's in them, whereas the one where it's negative has the R and the C.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So it's, in a sense, it may be just too much covariation. I mean, these kinds of things are sort of rat's nests of interacting variables, and this is just the R, D, and C. This is before we put all the other variables in. But I mean, yeah, I don't want you to agonize over my dirty linen, so to speak, and I have to sort this out. But I don't think we're at the bottom of this I mean, I've always been puzzled by Joe et al.'s results, because everything I see to do with markets is people get nasty, but I know it's a very strong result, and but we somehow haven't puzzled it out. And I know that Joe et al. Don't like looking at, they keep on looking at variation in your populations, and you don't find the variation. And I'm finding this variation, and I'm just begging you guys to look more, because I'm just sure there's more going on, just because I see it in my face in Mpimbwe. Yes?
This is just a follow-up, and this isn't me speaking, it's Matt. It's just Matt's being humble and not making this point, which is, I mean, one way of potentially reconciling those, right?
I'll look at Matt while you talk.
Yeah, you look at Matt. Is that the Joe et al. Results are about your default interaction with an unknown individual, and everything that you're exploring here is about people with whom you have relationships. And those can be very different, because you might say to succeed in a market economy, you have to be holding the PIF work aside, for example, because of questions about that.
Well, yeah, the statistical questions are not fair. I followed that up, but yeah.
Well,
all right, okay.
I mean, we'd want to see replications and a bunch of other stuff. Whereas, like the cross-cultural stuff on the games, it's clearly a more robust result.
Yeah.
So I have to trust that when I hand the cash to the grocery clerk, the grocery clerk is going to hand the groceries to me, and that the box boy didn't take the cereal out when I was looking at my wallet or whatever, and when I walk out of the store, I'm actually going to have what I expect to have, and they have to trust that it's not counterfeit and so on, right? In that interaction there, for success, for each of us to succeed in the market economy, we have to have some sort of general level of trust.
Yeah.
But that's it. That evaporates once I walk out of that relationship. Whereas if I pattern all of my interactions around expectations, be they positive or, in this case, often negative, about how people I know well will treat one another, I could get a totally different result, where I can succeed when I go to sell my goats in the marketplace, or my millet, or whatever it is, right? Because I'm doing that kind of an exchange right now. But I'm still going to screw my brother or my cousin or whatever, because I don't want to share with them when I don't have to.
Well, yeah, but Joe's, I mean, I take your point, but when you say Joe was dealing with interactions with people who weren't known, that's not really true, because the games were played with villagers. The interpretation put on it from that, when you plotted them on market integration, that was the interpretation put on. It may well be the right one, but it wasn't probably what the people were playing.
This is total Matt speaking. This is not Dan at all.
You don't know who the recipient is.
Exactly, within the village. They're people you love and people you hate.
But it's more than, finding is more than just, I mean, what what the Henrik studies showed was not just that you trust people, but that you actually were more generous with somebody else in your village if you were more market integrated, and that's...
Which is not what we're finding here, yeah.
Seems, so you're right that you need to trust the grocer, but I mean, why would people in more market integrated places actually give more to somebody else in the village?
Well,
it's not about trust, that's
okay,
about
so if you want to frame it in generosity terms, it's still about what is your default for interacting with a human in an unknown interaction, right? And the fact that they're members of your village, because the people you love and people you hate in the same village, it just washes out and you're dealing with a generic human, right? And so in some ways, it isn't any different than the grocery store example.
No, I'm not sure that's true. I mean, at least in the village where I ran them, people knew that they were going to benefit some other individual in the village. That it wasn't just some guy in Europe or something like that.
No, I'm not saying that they're confused. I'm saying that they can't resort to, and this is total math here. This is everything I've said so far. They can't resort to, their actual attitudes towards people based on past history,
right,
because they don't know who the recipient is.
But you can't say it washes out, because why would it be equally bad and good? It's more good, right? There's some people.
Because in the absence of the actual information that you would use to interact with those people, you resort to, well, this is like the grocery store. And if you're market integrated, you have that. And if you're not, you don't.
But you're assuming that they're judging the unknown person the same way. What if they may have one particular enemy they've made the previous day they really hate, and so everybody in the village, they're going to see through that colored glasses. Or they may not have any particular bee up their butt recently, and their general assumption is to be nicer to people in the village.
I don't think so.
Well, I think your discussion is great. Everybody's talking. I love it. But I think your discussion sort of makes the point that I mean, I love these games. They're fantastic for us to think about what's going on. There are some interesting patterns. But those of us who are more empiricists and keep on sort of collecting this kind of, well, not that you guys are not empiricists, but they're very, very hard to unravel what's going on, which is clearly what's going on in this discussion here. How you interpret it, how you unpack what is going on inside the brains. And so, I mean, that's kind of why, even though this is a statistical rat's nest, I think we need this kind of stuff because, I hate to sound like an old social anthropologist, but, most people are living in villages where most people they do know, and this whole market thing is kind of I mean, it's not new. Obviously, people have been trading for hundreds of thousands of years, but the level of anonymity in market interactions and the idea of a store is very weird. And I tell you, a store in Mpimbwe, I mean, there are a few of these guys who are making some money starting little stores. There is no trust whatsoever. I mean, every bag is opened up, sniffed, tasted, And if you don't, and when I shop and I just buy something, people look at me like I'm an idiot. So I now go through the same thing. So, this trust is, I mean, it's big in our society, but it's not in, well, you know very well, it's not in lots of other places. Yeah.
So do you think that, so one just basic question, are people that are wealthier also more market integrated, and then poorer people have less interaction with the market, or is everyone kind of equally, and some people are just really bad at it?
Yeah, no, definitely. No, it's good you asked that. Definitely people who are wealthier are more market integrated because they do. There's the district town, which is about 6 hours away on a bus. We now do have a bus that comes once a week to the area. They do have more opportunities to go to a town and try to, trade things. They're starting to trade crops. And I mean, actually, it's incredible. I just got a text message 3 days ago from one of my assistants, but just to think, she did have 2-3 bags, because they're harvesting now. She had 2-3 bags of maize, which he'd sent with some guys up some guys plus her husband up the escarpment, and they've never come back. I mean, they've never come back with the money, So this illustrates beautifully the point. But they are, generally they are. And I guess that's one reason. I was trying to, when I put that earlier slide on, I was trying to resurrect my logic as to why I'd said, and I don't think I ever answered Clark that, but why I thought that my results were somewhat going against the Henrik argument. And one is that the richer people, and I should have said this, are much more, to some extent more market integrated because of their involvement in the cash economy now, and yet they're the meanest. That would have been my simplest answer, yeah.
But it could be that they're living in two worlds, so they have like one set of norms for interacting with not market integrated people, and another set of norms for interacting with integrated
Yeah.
people who happen to be all the people in their household.
Yeah.
So maybe they're nicer and more trusting of this kind of person, but they're not at all trusting now of that other kind of.
That's totally
person.
possible. And one would have to devise very clever games to try to.
And do
You know.
20 more
You
years.
mentioned an ultimatum game. Were any other anonymous
We-
economic games run in this population?
Craig and Brian did the ultimatum and dictator game.
Yeah, did they have an individual wealth covariate?
We look, that's why I wanted them to do it, because Joe's first stuff was coming out, and I just didn't believe it. I said, you guys have got to do it. We did it between the two ethnic groups. We get some very interesting Sakuma Pimbwe stuff, which is all obviously to do with culturally transmitted information about how you should and should not. The Sakuma are super nice, and the Pimbwe are just mean as anything. But no, all the individual predictors I would have expected from this work didn't show up. But they did that work in 2002 or 2004, I can't remember. And a lot of these changes, like the road, only started coming in 2010. So actually it'd be kind of interesting to do that again. I'm just not willing to give up on the fact that your resource holding power, however it's measured, doesn't affect these outcomes. I cannot believe it. But I'm proven wrong over and over again. Yeah.
Well, I'm not trying to convince you because I'm actually very sympathetic to your intuitions. But are you familiar with the recent Nettle paper from Plus One that was kind of the counterpart
Yes.
to this paper, but it was done in Newcastle upon
Upon yeah. I've read it, and it's got into one of my folders as really interesting. I can't remember it.
No, I mean, it's more or less the converse pattern where they had two very well-matched neighborhoods who varied in SES.
Yes, right.
And they found that the richer people were more generous in a dictator game. The poorer people were less likely to pick up a dropped letter.
Yes.
And that they did a few different domains of pro-sociality and found
That's right,
the converse.
yes.
And I'm thinking that Matt/Dan might have an argument that gives some traction on how to interpret this, because again, all of the DVs, I think in that study, or the study series.
All of the what?
All the dependent measures.
Yeah.
Were with strangers or with unspecified. So for, you're gonna pick up a dropped letter.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
doesn't have any of the kind of, relationship qualities of what you're looking at.
Right.
But I just what do you make of, so you just basically don't know, it's an anomaly? The Nettle.
What's the negative relationship at the moment in here?
How do you reconcile that? It's sort of follow-up.
I think probably my intuitions are kind of what Michelle was saying. The way I've been thinking about it is they are sort of thinking of moving. This is quite a mobile. Pimbwe are moving in and out the village. I've surveyed this village like 7 or 8 times now, and there's always like 10-15% turnover. All the divorces, people coming, going, people coming from broken marriages elsewhere, and so there's a lot of mobility, and there's increasing opportunity to move to towns which have a little bit more economic opportunities. So I really think what we're seeing is the emergence of 2 life ways, maybe 2 sets of ways of calculating things. There are people, some of these rich families are already thinking of maybe, they'll maybe send a younger son or something to go and live in Mpanda, the town, and maybe he'll try and set up a store there, and they'll try to do some business or some kind of service thing. So I think it's just you're with the way I told the story. You're trying to withdraw from the traditional networks that are just like glue on you, like our assistant Peter. You've just got to extract yourself from your family, and you've got to get yourself into this other kind of life. And the other kind of life. What?
And you're saying, and then when they get there and are
they go to Newcastle, right?
Then they'll become
Just like rich Newcastlers. One more. Oh, sorry.